They called her a Mutt. They said it in the great hall, in front of 32 council elders and every high-ranked wolf who had come to witness the winter solstice convocation, and not one of them looked away in shame. The woman who said it wore silk dyed the color of frost-bitten roses, and stood on the dais as though the world had been arranged beneath her feet specifically for her comfort. And the girl she said it to stood in the doorway, with a pail of ash water in her hands, and mud still drying on her boots from the outer ward, and she did not flinch. What no one in that hall understood, in the year of the frost convocation, in the 3rd year of Jasper Silvermane's reign, was that the Mutt would be the one to keep the king alive, and that the king would kneel for her before those same 32 witnesses before the season was out. If you have ever been told your place by someone who was comfortable in theirs, stay with this story. Leave a comment below when the kennel door closes. You will want to see what opens instead. The year of the frost convocation arrived on a killing cold. The keep at Vordenmere stood on a ridge above a frozen gorge, its stones so old they had begun to absorb the gray of the sky above them, and the wind that came off the black pine forest each evening carried ice in it, the kind that found the gap between collar and skin and settled there like a small, deliberate punishment. Maren had lived in the lowest tier of that keep for 3 years, since the council's registry had reclassified her mother's house following the execution. That was the word they used in the records. Reclassified. Her mother had been a pack healer, trained in the old methods, respected by every family in the outer wards, and then Councillor Voss had needed her dispensary and her silence, and when she would not sell either, the charge of unlicensed wolf bonding had been enough. The record said executed. The keep's registry said reclassified. Maren had learned not to say either word aloud. She scrubbed floors in the lower hall and carried firewood from the east yard and emptied ash pails in the gray hours before dawn, and in the hours between she slept on a cot in the laundry room next to the boiler, which at least was warm. Petra slept 2 cots over, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s who had been laundering the keep's linen since before Jasper took the throne, and who knew every passage, every shortcut, every door in the stone that appeared to be wall, if you did not press the 3rd block from the left at shoulder height. Petra knew things. She dispensed them in small portions, the way a cautious person parcels out bread when the next delivery is uncertain. The first thing Petra told Maren about the solstice convocation was to stay small and stay toward the walls. The second thing she said was that Ilara would be looking for a target. Ilara was the appointed Luna, placed at Jasper's right hand by council resolution 2 years prior, after the position had sat empty for long enough that the elders had begun muttering about instability and succession. She was the daughter of Elder Ranwick, who held 4 seats on the council and whose political weight had made the appointment less a question than a declaration. Whether Jasper had accepted the arrangement willingly was not a question anyone asked in Maren's hearing, though sometimes she noticed the distance he kept from Ilara at formal gatherings, a deliberate 2 feet of cold air that the council pretended not to see. Ilara herself did not seem to notice it, or did not allow herself to. She dressed for attention and moved through the keep as though its walls existed to frame her, and she was generous with her contempt for anyone below the 7th rank, which included almost everyone Maren had ever spoken to. Maren was not ranked at all. The registry listed her as unclassified domestic. Below the 7th rank by such a distance that the distance had no practical name. On the evening of the solstice, the great hall filled with an assembly that included every council elder, 4 visiting pack alphas from the Eastern Territories, and a retinue of foreign observers whose banners Maren did not recognize. She had been assigned to carry wood for the hearth that occupied the hall's north wall, a hearth wide enough to walk into, which burned pine and birch and filled the upper air with a resinous warmth that could not quite reach the cold stone floor. She made 3 trips before the assembly was fully seated, and on each pass, She kept to the shadow of the eastern colonnade, pail in hand, ash-stained, invisible in the way that only people in service uniforms can manage. She was on her fourth trip, with birchwood stacked to her chin, when Ilara spotted her from the dais. "You," Ilara said, and the word was a pin dropped into a room gone quiet. Marin stopped. She could see the dais clearly from where she stood, the high seat empty, the council chairs ranked below it in a crescent. The 32 elders in their formal robes looking at her with the particular expression of people who are watching something they do not intend to intervene in. Ilara stood at the edge of the dais platform, her frost rose silk catching the firelight, her chin lifted at the angle of someone measuring whether a thing is worth the effort of dismissing. "I said you," Ilara repeated. "The one carrying the wood like a barn animal. What is your station?" Marin set the birch wood down at the base of the hearth. She straightened. She said, in a voice she kept even with some effort. "Domestic service, my lady. Scullery." "Scullery?" Ilara repeated, giving the word an amused weight, as though she were trying a flavor she found beneath her. She looked at the council, and some of the elders did smile, the comfortable smile of men who had been told what things were worth for so long that they had stopped checking. "What is your name?" "Marin." "No house name?" A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. "No, my lady." Ilara let the pause do its work for her. Then she lifted her hand in a gesture that was technically dismissive, but contained within it the full force of an announcement, and she said, "Let the mutt sleep in the kennels. The hall is for wolves with names." The laughter was not loud, but it was present. It moved through the crescent of council chairs like a small wave, and it reached the visiting pack alphas, who said nothing but whose silence had a shape to it, the shape of men committing a judgment to memory. Marin did not look at the floor. She looked at the center of the room, at a point above the assembly's collective head, and she picked up her ash pail, and she walked out through the servants' door at the hall's south end with exactly the same pace she had walked in. Petra was waiting in the passage outside, folding a length of linen with the mechanical composure of a person who has learned to look occupied in difficult moments. She did not ask what had happened. She handed Marin a cup of weak grain tea from somewhere in her apron and said, "Stay in the laundry room tonight. The outer ward is frozen solid." Marin drank the tea. "I need to check the ash barrels in the east yard." "The east yard can wait. They'll overflow by morning." Petra looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman taking the measure of an argument she knows she will lose. "Fine," she said. "Use the passage I showed you. The one behind the boiler room. Goes out by the kitchen garden gate. Don't use the main ward crossing." Marin used the passage. It was Petra's network of such routes that made the keep navigable when you held the rank of unclassified domestic, a rank that meant, in practice, that you were visible to anyone who wanted to use you and invisible to anyone who might protect you. The passage behind the boiler room was low-ceilinged and smelled of old stone and damp wool, and it led out behind a stone trough that in summer would have held kitchen herb cuttings, but in this frost held only a skin of black ice. Beyond it, the east yard opened in the dark, lit only by the keep's tower lanterns and the hard, cold starlight coming off the frozen gorge below. Marin saw him before she reached the ash barrels. He was in the shadow between the yard's east wall and the old mounting block, a low stone shelf that in an earlier century had served the cavalry, and now served no one. He was on the ground, which was wrong, and his breathing was audible from 8 feet away, which was also wrong. Jasper Silvermane did not make sounds in public that he did not intend to make. She had observed that much in 3 years of carrying wood through his halls. She went toward him because she had her mother's habits, which preceded her common sense by several steps in situations involving someone who was injured and had no one nearby. Up close, he was gray-faced in the lantern light, which, on a man of his coloring, a brown-skinned northerner whose complexion normally held the warmth of someone accustomed to cold air and hard exertion, was alarming. His breathing came in intervals that were too controlled to be natural, the intervals of someone who has chosen to regulate a process that is trying to become irregular on its own. His left hand was against the stone wall and his right hand was loosely fisted against the frozen ground beside him. She could see a fine tremor in both. She knew what wolfsbane did to a werewolf's body. Her mother had spent 2 years treating a pack beta who had been exposed during a border ambush, using the slow counteragent method she had developed herself, the one that required continuous dosing over multiple nights, and the precise combination of white bark extract and dried river moss, and something Marin's mother had called the cold compound, though its proper name was in the healer's notation that Marin had memorized by 8 years old. She crouched beside him and said, very quietly, "My lord." His eyes opened. They were dark, and in the lantern light they had an unsteadiness in them that she suspected he would have found objectionable if he had been well. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working to place her, to retrieve whatever register of the keep's population she occupied, and then something shifted. Some involuntary thing that she could not name, and he breathed in once, sharp and deep, as though the cold air had changed. She did not know what that meant. She attributed it to the fever. "Can you stand?" she asked. He did not answer, which she took as a no. "There is a passage behind the east wall," she said. "It enters the keep through the scullery corridor. If I can get you there, I can reach my supplies without going through the main hall." He looked at her for another moment. Then, with the deliberate action of someone making a considered choice, rather than accepting help, he moved his hand to the mounting block and began pushing himself upright. She did not offer her arm until he was halfway there, and when she did, she put it at his elbow rather than around him, which seemed to be the right calibration because he accepted it. They crossed the east yard in the dark, which took twice as long as it should have, and entered the passage, and she guided him through it by memory, one hand on the wall. She brought him to a room that had no name in the keep's registry, a dry stone chamber off the scullery corridor that had once been a root cellar, and now stored nothing but empty shelving and a bench with a cracked leg. She had been using it for 3 months to store her mother's herb case, which she had carried out of the dispensary the night of the execution wrapped in an old laundry sack, and which no one had thought to look for, because no one in authority had considered the possibility that the unclassified domestic might have anything worth looking for. She opened the herb case by lantern light while he sat on the bench, and she began the first stage of the cold compound preparation, which required 40 minutes and an even temperature, and the careful concentration she had been taught to treat as its own kind of prayer. He watched her in silence. The scent lock, she would learn much later, had happened in the east yard when she crouched beside him. He had been in the grip of a wolfsbane fever that was entering its 2nd day, and his wolf sense, stripped of the rational filters he kept on it at all costs, had simply identified what was in front of him with a recognition that bypassed every constructed hierarchy and every considered judgment. His wolf had known before the fever broke. He would not admit that to himself for 4 more days. He felt it, though. Even then, even in the grip of the tremor and the gray-faced labor of his breathing, something in him settled when she knelt beside the herb case with the focused quiet of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. If you are watching this and you have ever kept a skill alive that the world told you was worthless, leave it in the comments. What she knew next was going to matter more than anyone in that keep had assigned it. She administered the first dose before the 2nd hour. She did not tell him it would take 4 nights, not yet, because she understood that a man of his nature might prefer to refuse the treatment rather than accept the dependency, and she needed him to accept the first dose before she could make the case for the rest. By the time the first dose had taken enough effect to reduce the tremor, he was past the point of arguing. "Your name," he said, at some point in the 3rd hour. "Marin," she said. He did not say anything else that night. The 2nd night she brought Petra into it, because the river moss supply in the herb case was running low, and Petra knew the keep's dispensary schedule and could take a portion without triggering an inventory flag. She told Petra only that she had a patient who needed discretion. Petra looked at her for a long moment in the boiler room's yellow light and said, "If it's who I think it is, you need to know who put the poison in his wine." Marin stopped wrapping the herb packet. "Tell me." "Overheard it from the passage behind the council antechamber," Petra said. "The one that runs behind the north wall." Voss and a man I didn't recognize, Eastern accent, spoke like a man used to being obeyed. They were discussing timing. Voss said the dosing would need 4 nights to reach full incapacity, and by the 5th morning the council motion would be in order. Marin's hands were still. Motion for what? Petra's expression was carefully neutral in the way of someone delivering information they would rather not be delivering. Succession, she said. Emergency authority transferred to the council during incapacity of the reigning alpha. Voss holds enough seats to pass it, if he has 4 votes from the visiting alphas, and the man with the Eastern accent sounded like someone who could provide those votes. The herb packet sat between them on the laundry shelf for a moment. "His name?" Marin asked. "Devon," Petra said. The man said it once. Voss called him Lord Alpha. Marin knew nothing about a Lord Alpha named Devon except that Eastern warlord titles ran to conquest rather than inheritance, and that any man who would enter a private arrangement with Voss to transfer a throne was not arriving with peaceful intentions. She filed the name in the same careful mental ledger where she kept her mother's healer notation, and the keep's passage routes, and every other thing that the world had told her was not hers to carry. She kept the herb packet. She went back through the passage. On the 3rd night, Jasper was well enough to object to things. He objected to the low bench on grounds that it was a poor surface for a man of his height, which was accurate. He objected to the coldness of the stone floor in terms that were more restrained than the situation perhaps warranted. He did not object to the medicine, and he did not object to her presence, which she registered without allowing herself to make too much of it. She told him what Petra had overheard. She gave him the information plainly, without softening, and without the preface of asking whether he wanted to hear it. Because she had found in 3 years of keeping her head down in a court full of ranked wolves that the fastest way to be dismissed was to signal that you were asking permission. She simply told him, "Voss, a 4-night dosing plan, a visiting Lord Alpha named Devon, and a council succession motion scheduled for the 5th morning." He was quiet through the entire account. She had expected anger or disbelief, the 2 reactions she would have predicted from a powerful man being told that his most senior counselor had been poisoning him with the aim of installing a foreign warlord's proxy on his throne. What she got instead was a stillness so complete that she could hear the wood shifting in the small brazier she had brought on the 2nd night. Then he said, "How long have you known about the council passages?" 3 years, she said. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "And what else have you observed in 3 years?" "Many things," she said, which was accurate. The stillness in him shifted slightly, towards something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. She would not let herself assign too much meaning to it. What she did not know, what she would not let herself know, was that the thing she had felt every time she entered that room, the warmth that seemed to come from somewhere other than the brazier, the odd sensation that the cold of the stone floor was less when she crossed from the passage into the chamber, was a Bond symptom as old as the pack's oldest recorded histories. She attributed it to the brazier. The brazier was doing no such thing. On the 4th night, Counselor Voss came for her. Not directly. He sent a man named Reth, one of the keep's household guards, which told her that Voss had been watching the scullery corridor and had noticed the herb case's supply changes and had drawn a conclusion she could not now undraw for him. Reth knocked twice on the laundry room door at the 9th hour and delivered the message with the flat affect of a man who is delivering a communication he finds unpleasant but regards as outside his authority to modify. The message was that Marin was to report to the council anteroom at dawn to answer a question regarding unauthorized access to restricted corridors. Petra was sitting up in her cot when Reth's footsteps receded down the hall. "That's the pre-motion warning," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of a woman who has stayed steady through multiple things the world had given her no particular reason to survive. "When they want the charge formal, they bring you in the hour before the vote." Marin sat on the edge of her own cot for a moment, aware that the 4th dose was not yet administered, and that the 5th morning was, by Voss's timetable, the morning she was currently approaching. She looked at the herb case, open on the floor beside her. The cold compound remaining was sufficient for one more full dose and a partial 5th. She made a decision. She went through the passage. She told Jasper about the summons in the same direct way she had told him about Devon, as though she were reporting a fact about the weather, and while she administered the 4th dose, she said, "The motion will be brought at dawn. Voss has the votes if Devon's proxies hold, and the charge against me removes the only person who has known what you've been given and why. That is likely the point of it." She was not asking for his help. She was not performing distress. She was telling him what was true, and she was going back to the cot to wait for dawn, or that was what she intended. His hand closed around her wrist as she reached for the passage door. The spark was sharp and immediate, a warmth that started at the point of contact and moved up her arm with the deliberate insistence of a thing that has been waiting with considerable patience. She did not pull away. She went very still. He said in a voice that was lower than usual and carried in it the first edge of something that was not authority but was adjacent to it, "You are not going to that anteroom. My lord, if I don't appear, the charge becomes an admission, and the motion carries without examination." "You are not going," he said, and something in the word "not" carried a weight she felt in her sternum. The weight of a man who has made a decision at considerable cost to the orderly structure he has built around himself. His grip on her wrist was not rough. It was absolute. If Voss had been listening at the passage door, he would have heard nothing. He was not at the passage door. He was in the council anteroom, going over the wording of his emergency succession motion for the 3rd time with a cup of warmed wine and the satisfaction of a man who has built something careful and is approaching the moment of its use. What he did not know was that Jasper Silvermane had spent 4 nights in a cold root cellar room with a woman whose scent his wolf had memorized on the 1st night, and that the 4th dose was the clearest he had been in 80 hours, and that clarity had confirmed for him what the fever had been insisting on since the East Yard. At the hour before dawn, when the keep was at its most still, when the tower lanterns had burned to their 2nd wick, and the frozen gorge below reflected the last stars in a thin silver line, Jasper walked out of the unnamed room, through the scullery corridor, and into the main keep passage with Marin beside him. He had not asked permission to come with her. He had simply come. They did not reach the council anteroom, because the council anteroom was where Voss expected to receive her, and Jasper went instead to the great hall, which at that hour held only the residual warmth of the previous night's fire and the long shadows of the colonnade. He pushed both doors open, not with force but with the calm of a man for whom closed doors are an inconvenience rather than an obstacle. He said to the hall's single night guard, a young wolf named Kennels, who had been awake for 5 hours and whose alertness was functioning more from obligation than from genuine readiness, "Send to every council elder, the morning assembly is moved to the hall, now." Connell sent. Marin stood in the doorway of the great hall while the assembly assembled, and she registered the fact that she was standing in the doorway of the same hall from which she had been walked out the night before, with a pail in her hand and laughter behind her. The cold was still coming through the stone. The shadows were in the same places. She was wearing the same boots with the mud dried on them. Nothing had changed that she could see, and everything had. The 32 council elders arrived in various states of preparation, and the 4 visiting pack alphas arrived behind them, and Ilara arrived still in her sleeping robes with a fury on her face that she was visibly exercising restraint not to voice, and Petra arrived last in the back doorway near the hearth, having come through a passage that Marin had shown her 2 years ago, carrying a dry cloth she did not need, standing where she could see. Then a horn sounded from the main gate, and the assembly's attention fractured. Devon had ridden through the night. He arrived at the gate with 40 riders, which was a substantial escort, and also a significant miscalculation, because Jasper's own pack had been summoned by the secondary horn call that Jasper had ordered Connell to send along with the council summons. 40 riders hit the gate at the same moment as 160 pack wolves in their shifted forms, and the collision at the gate was brief and comprehensive. Davon was pulled from his horse in the outer yard with the efficiency of a force that outweighed his by a factor of 4, and the horn at the gate went silent. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Jasper stood at the head of the great hall, and he looked at the 32 elders in their crescent, and he said, Voss. Councillor Voss was in the 4th seat from the left, which was his permanent council position and which he had occupied for 19 years. He was a careful man, thin-faced, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who has spent 2 decades being the most dangerous person in any given room while appearing to be the most reasonable. He looked at Jasper, and for perhaps 2 seconds the mask held. Then Jasper said, Show me your hands. Voss's left hand had a particular callus on the index finger, one Marin had identified from her mother's records, the callus that develops on the hand of someone who regularly handles the small glass dosing instruments used in concentrated wolfsbane preparation. Her mother had written about it in the healer's notation, in the section on treatment of malicious exposure cases, because it was a reliable indicator of prolonged contact with the preparation process. Marin said, from where she stood, My mother documented that mark, before she was executed on his orders. The hall went very still. Voss said, The girl is an unregistered domestic with no standing before this council. Ilara, who had been watching from her position near the dais, with the expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation in real time, said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual register, Tell them the rest, counselor. Every head turned. Ilara stood with her hands clasped in front of her, the frost rose silk slightly crumpled from being put on too quickly, and she looked at Voss with an expression that was not courage exactly, but was the look of a woman who has calculated that the ship she is on is sinking and has located the nearest surface. Tell them how my appointment was made, she said. Tell them what you told my father, and what my father told me, and why I have been standing at a right hand that was never mine to stand at. Voss did not tell them. Ilara did. The account was 45 seconds long and covered the following. Voss had approached Elder Ranwick 3 years prior with a proposal that amounted to a coercion, a council appointment for Ilara in exchange for Ranwick's votes on a series of land registry amendments that had enabled Voss to consolidate significant resource holdings in the keep's eastern territories. The appointment was never a genuine Luna bond. It was a political weight placed on a living person who had been told it was an honor and had not been in a position to examine the seams. The bond is false, Jasper said, not as a discovery but as a confirmation of something he had known without permitting himself to act on. He looked at Voss. And the execution of Marin's mother, which you registered as unlicensed wolf bonding, was the removal of the healer most likely to identify your access to wolfsbane preparation. Voss's hand, the left hand with the callus, curled closed at his side. 2 of the visiting pack alphas had risen from their chairs. The assembly was very still. Jasper walked to the center of the hall. His steps were steady. The 4th dose had held, and his strength was not complete. but what it lacked in fullness it compensated for in the quality of his will, which was the thing that had always made him difficult to manage. He stood in the center of the room, and the air organized itself around him in the particular way that it did when he chose to make his authority present rather than implied. He looked at Maren. She was still in the doorway. She had not moved to be less visible. She was not performing composure. She was simply composed, in the way of a woman who has been in difficult places before and has developed, through repetition and necessity, the ability to stand in them without shrinking. He crossed the hall to her. He was aware, in a way that had nothing to do with the assembly watching, that the distance he was crossing was not the distance between the center of the great hall and the south doorway. He had crossed that distance 4 nights ago, in the east yard, when she had crouched beside him on frozen ground with a pail in her hand and her mother's knowledge in her hands and no reason at all to help him except that it was what she was. He stood before her. He said, "Maren." She said, "My lord." He said, "Not my lord." He went down on one knee on the flagstones of the great hall, and the sound of it, the single sound of his knee on the stone, was the only sound in the room for a long moment. One of the council elders made a small involuntary sound and stopped himself. The visiting pack alphas had gone completely still. The assembly watched with the quality of attention that people give to things they understand they will be asked about later. Jasper said, from one knee, looking up at her, "You kept my life. You carried a truth the court wanted buried. You stood in this hall yesterday and walked out of it with your head straight, and you came back through the passage and you were still yourself. I am not presenting you with a political appointment." A pause, and then, simply, "You are my mate. You have been since the East Yard, and I have been slow to say it." Marin's hands, which had been steady through 4 nights of poison treatment and a dawn summons and 32 council elders and a warlord at the gate, developed a slight tremor at her sides. She allowed it. She said, "You were very unwell." Something moved across his face that was not a smile exactly, but which occupied the same space a smile would have, and which she thought she would recognize again if she saw it. "I was," he said. "I am considerably better." He rose. He took her hand, the one nearest him, with the careful attention of a man handling something he intends to keep, and he turned to face the assembly. He said with the full carrying weight of his authority in his voice, "Before this council, before the witnesses of the Frost Convocation Assembly, before every elder and visiting alpha in this hall, I claim Maren as my Luna. The false appointment is dissolved. The political coercion that created it is a matter of record, and the council will address it as such." The first elder to rise from his seat was not Voss. It was Elder Karis, an old woman from the keep's northern circuit who had sat on the council for longer than Jasper had been alive, and who had a reputation for moving when she was ready and not before. She rose to her feet and she inclined her head, not the small, efficient nod of a political concession, but the deep, full bow of formal pack acknowledgement. Then the elder beside her. Then the next. One by one, around the crescent. 29 of the 32. The 3 who held their seats were Voss, Elder Ranwick, and a third elder named Bracht, who had been in Voss's coalition for 6 years and was now performing a calculation that was not going well for him. Voss was arrested by Jasper's guard at the north exit of the hall, which was the exit he had edged toward when the assembly began to bow. He was charged with wolfsbane poisoning of the reigning alpha, conspiracy for succession by external force, and the prior falsified execution of a pack healer. The emergency succession motion he had prepared was already invalid, and the wording of it, when it was retrieved from the council anteroom and read to the assembly, detailed his arrangement with Devon more explicitly than he had perhaps intended, which simplified the proceedings considerably. Davan was stripped of his alpha title by the joint agreement of the visiting pack alphas, all four of whom had had time in the preceding hour to realize that they had been invited under the impression of a legal succession process and had nearly been accessories to an armed coup, and who were uniformly eager to register their position clearly on the record. Ilara, who had spoken, was given the choice between exile and council review of her appointment's origins, which was not really a choice. She took the exile. She was given 2 hours to take what was hers and leave through the main gate, and she did so with her head at an angle that could have been shame or could have been the frost wind. And Marin, who was watching from the hall's south doorway, did not feel the satisfaction she might have expected. She felt mostly tired. And then she felt Jasper's hand settle at the small of her back with a careful and particular weight, and she felt, instead of tired, present. Petra found her 2 hours later in the lower corridor outside the laundry room, where Marin had gone to retrieve the herb case and the few other things she owned worth moving. Petra was carrying a dry cloth she had not needed for some time, and her eyes were red at the edges, and she pressed both of Marin's hands between hers for a moment, and could not seem to manage a sentence, which for Petra, who rarely went 3 minutes without one, was a significant occurrence. Marin said, "I'll need the passage route to the upper chambers, the one behind the east stair." Petra pressed her hands harder and said, voice somewhat unsteady, "You already know it. I showed you." "You showed me to the third landing," Marin said. "Not to the fourth." Petra made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else, and said, "The fourth block from the left at shoulder height. Same as always." In the great hall, the council elders took their seats to begin the formal record of the session. The fire in the north hearth had been fed and was burning high again, and the resinous warmth was reaching the stone floor this time, or perhaps it only seemed that way. 32 elders and 32 chairs, and one chair at the head of the crescent that had been empty before dawn, and now had a different configuration to the room around it. The configuration that a room acquires when the person who belongs in its center is finally standing there. Marin walked through the passage behind the east stair and came out on the fourth landing and did not kneel at the threshold of Jasper's chamber, because she was not a guest, and she was no longer in the lower corridors. And the part of her that had learned to be small in this keep was in the process of learning something new. Jasper was at the window, looking out over the gorge, and the blood moon that had followed the solstice night was low over the black pine forest, throwing a thin red light over the frozen gorge that made the ice look copper bright. He heard her enter, and he did not turn immediately, and she understood this as a version of the same composure she had seen in him across 4 nights in a cold room. The composure of a man who manages himself very carefully in most circumstances, and is now in the presence of the one exception. He turned. She was still in the boots with the mud on them. He looked at the boots and then up at her, and the thing that crossed his face this time was unmistakable. He said, "You brought the herb case." She had. It was in her hand, the same old sack she had wrapped it in the night of her mother's execution, worn thin at the seam, but holding. "The dispensary will need restocking," she said. "The cold compound requires 3 components that aren't currently in inventory. I'll need authority to request them from the eastern supply route." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You'll have it. And my mother's name should be restored to the registry," she said. "The execution record reclassified." "Corrected," he said. "Not reclassified. Corrected." She looked at him. He held out his hand, open, palm up, the scarred right hand of a man who has spent a reign controlling every room he walked into, open now on the air between them like a plain and irreversible question. She set her hand in it. Outside, the blood moon sat full and low over the gorge, and the black pines held still in a wind that had quieted between one breath and the next, and somewhere below, in the laundry room off the scullery corridor, Petra sat on her cot with the dry cloth in her lap and her eyes still red at the edges and did not sleep, and thought about the passages she had shown a girl 3 years ago, and how some roots, if you teach them to the right person, carry them somewhere you could never have gotten to yourself. In the morning, when the assembly reconvened for the formal notation of the session's events, Marin stood at Jasper's right hand. The herb case was in the dispensary. The 32 elders were in their seats. The Eastern supply order was already written in Jasper's hand and sealed with his mark. Elder Karras bowed first. The court followed. The mud had dried on Marin's boots from the night before, and she had not yet cleaned it off, and she did not, just then, intend to.